And they'll call you back.
Well, the issue of land is an emotive one for many South Africans. With that in mind, the Vumelana Advisory Fund got together with 40 individuals from various backgrounds to engage in constructive debate to see how we could shape the future of land reform by putting together 4 alternative scenarios. We're chatting now with Brian Whitaker, who's Director and Strategic Advisor at Vumelana Advisory Fund, to talk about that particular project. Brian, thanks so much for your time today. Such an emotive and one subject that really lands people in hot water quite often. So what was the experience like of putting these people with different needs, interests and wants?
Well, the interesting thing about this was that after people have spent some time together, we're talking about scenarios that we built over a period of a year. We came up with 4 of those scenarios, and this very diverse group of people from business, from government, from civil society, traditional leaders, a very, very wide group, eventually got to know one another, and they got to be able to talk about issues, one, because they got to know one another, but also because the scenarios process opens up ways to tell stories.
Yeah.
So that we're saying to people, stand back from trying to persuade each other. Let's not try and persuade one another we're right, I'm right or you're right.
Yeah.
Let's just stand back and say, what do we think could happen? And when you say that to people, they kind of relax a little bit.
Okay.
And so the scenarios process gets that going.
So very briefly, what could happen?
Well, what this very diverse group of people concluded was that without wanting to make predictions and without suggesting that these are proposals, they think that the things that could happen were captured under 4 simple titles. The first was concentration and capture.
Yeah.
So they were saying that one of the things that might happen, and we hear some of this already, is that political parties who find themselves under pressure, particularly the ruling party, decide that they have to build a base in the rural areas. They begin to establish relationships with traditional leaders and eventually do a sort of a votes for land deal.
Okay.
As a result of which people are brought to the polls to support the ruling party. But the end of that is that people develop a sense that only the well-connected can win.
Would be able to win. All right. Scenario 2.
So the second scenario we called occupation and confiscation.
Okay.
This is the scenario that emerges when ordinary people get tired of waiting. And we hear some of this in the wings already, don't we? So they decide that they're going to occupy the land. They're encouraged to do this by some leaders. And eventually the government, fearing anarchy, caves in and changes the constitution, and this leads to confiscation without compensation. And the end result of that is a rapid loss of investment and the damaging of lives of even those people who occupied the land.
Okay.
So that's the second scenario, which is really about confiscation. The third one is about market power and concentration. In this scenario, the racial profile of the ownership of land changes, and we meet our target. We're able to transfer 30% of the land, but we don't change the structure of agriculture at all.
Okay.
And what happens is that people are still left with the sense that it's only a small group of people. It used to be a small group of white people, now it's a small group of black people who happen to own all the land, and the majority of the people still feel excluded.
Okay.
The fourth scenario then we called hard bargaining and compromise. And this is a scenario that was based on the government really opening up the process to bring in more voices, to make sure many people are included. It's also a scenario that relies to some extent on increased economic growth. And in this scenario, groups get together all over the country and begin to do deals that meet the needs of all of the people involved.
Okay, but there's still some criticism of scenario 4, right? What would need to happen to make it a worthwhile?
So the criticism that I've heard, ordinary people, of this fourth scenario, which is often, presented, we tried not to create these as, one, 3 straw men, one good idea.
Yeah.
We all of these have pluses and minuses, and the minuses, I hear from people on scenario 4 is they say, oh yes, this whole bargaining and compromise is fine, but we know it's going to be the same old faces around the table. And the majority of us are going to be left out again. And so that if we want to move towards a situation like that, we have to be sure that it's inclusive.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks for your time today. Brian Whittaker is Director and Strategic Advisor at Vumelana Advisory Fund. Now, the next 8 years will likely see an above-inflation year-on-year electricity tariff hike of between 6 and 8%. This can be attributed to the large infrastructure investments that Eskom is currently making that are likely to affect energy tariffs in the near future. It's important for business owners to consider alternative sources of energy if they are to cushion the impact